November 30th, 1853. The Black Sea. The storm had broken sometime before dawn, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. Sinop harbour, a crescent-shaped wound carved into the Anatolian coastline, lay wrapped in fog so thick that men standing at the bow of a ship could not see its stern. The water was the colour of old pewter, flat and cold, carrying the smell of brine and wet timber, and something else beneath it, something metallic, like the air before lightning strikes. On the shore, the minarets of Sinop's mosques pierced the mist like pale fingers reaching toward a sky that offered nothing. It was the kind of morning that made sailors uneasy. The kind of morning when the sea seems to be listening. Aboard the Ottoman frigate Avni Illa, the men coming off the night watch moved below deck with the slow, heavy steps of the exhausted. They had ridden out the storm. 3 days of howling wind that had driven Vice Admiral Osman Pasha's squadron into this harbour and pinned them there like butterflies under glass. The fleet had been heading east toward Georgia, carrying supplies to Ottoman land forces pressing against the Russian frontier in the Caucasus. But the Black Sea in November is no place for wooden ships and ambition, and the storm had made the decision for them. Now they rested. 7 frigates, 3 corvettes, 2 armed steamers, their anchors set deep in Sinop's mud, their crews half ashore, their guns run in. Osman Pasha knew the Russians were out there, somewhere beyond the fog. He had known since November 23rd. But his harbour defences were strong, forts with interlocking fields of fire, shore batteries bristling with cannon. He felt safe. He was wrong. Out beyond the harbour mouth, in the grey anonymity of open water, 6 Russian ships of the line sat in patient formation. 6 against 14. But numbers here meant almost nothing, because these Russian ships carried something the Ottomans had never faced in battle. Pasha's guns. Shell guns. Weapons that fired not solid iron balls, but explosive projectiles that buried themselves deep into wooden hulls before detonating, turning timber into shrapnel, turning ships into furnaces. The technology was barely a decade old. Admiral Pavel Nakhimov had drilled his gun crews on these weapons for months. They were ready. The Ottomans, in their wooden frigates, with their smooth-bore cannon, were fighting with the weapons of one century against the weapons of the next. This is not just a story about one naval battle. It is the story of how a single morning's violence pulled 3 empires into the largest war Europe had seen since Napoleon. How the smoke rising from burning Ottoman ships was seen all the way in London and Paris, and set governments trembling, and how the conflict that followed would shatter the old order of Europe and announce the birth of something new and terrible: modern warfare. The Crimean War changed the world, and it began, like so many world-changing catastrophes, with a fog-shrouded harbour and a fleet that didn't know it was already dead. In 30 minutes, Nakhimov would not just destroy a squadron. He would light a fuse that burned for 3 years and consumed 650,000 lives. The smoke that rose from Sinop harbour on November 30th, 1853, was the smoke of a dying world, and a new one being born in fire. To understand why that harbour burned, you have to go back further. You have to go back to a sick man who refused to admit he was dying, and an ambitious man who refused to admit the patient might survive. And the 2 great powers who stood at the bedside, arguing over who would inherit the furniture. The Ottoman Empire, in the middle of the 19th century, was the longest-running act of civilizational inertia in history. At its peak, 2 centuries earlier, it had been the most powerful state on earth, a structure of terrifying efficiency that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf, from the Crimean coast to the burning sands of North Africa. Suleiman the Magnificent had made European kings tremble. Ottoman janissaries had been the finest infantry in the world. The empire's trading networks had enriched generations. But empires do not die quickly. They decline in stages, each generation inheriting a slightly smaller and more brittle version of the original. Until one day, someone looks at the accounts and realizes that the great machine has been running on reputation alone for years. By 1853, the Ottoman Empire had been running on reputation for decades. Its treasury was empty, sustained only by loans from British and French banks. Its army was a patchwork of inadequately trained and poorly paid soldiers, commanded by officers who had purchased their ranks. Its vast territory, encompassing dozens of ethnic groups, 3 major religions, and 100 competing local interests, was held together by habit and inertia rather than genuine administrative control. Tsar Nicholas I of Russia looked at this crumbling edifice and saw opportunity wrapped in necessity. He called Turkey the sick man of Europe. He said it at a diplomatic dinner, casually, as one might note that a neighbour's house needed painting. But behind the casual tone was a plan, and behind the plan was an appetite that no diplomatic courtesy could fully conceal. Nicholas I enters this story not through biography, but through action, and the action that defines him is a conversation. One of those conversations where a man says something he believes to be reasonable, and in doing so reveals everything about how he thinks. In January 1853, the Tsar met with British Ambassador Sir George Hamilton Seymour in St. Petersburg. The meeting was cordial. The wine was good. And Nicholas began, almost offhandedly, to discuss the coming dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. Not as a possibility to be feared, but as a certainty to be managed. He suggested that Russia might take control of the Danubian principalities, that Britain might be compensated with Egypt and Crete, that together the 2 powers could carve the dying empire into manageable pieces. He spoke of it the way a man discusses the sale of a neighbour's property while the neighbour is still alive. He was not a monster. He genuinely believed he was being reasonable. He was also completely, catastrophically wrong about how Britannia would receive this proposal. The British response was cool, measured, and absolutely final. The dissolution of the Ottoman Empire was not inevitable, was not desirable, and was not going to be negotiated over dinner by uninvited parties. Seymour reported back to London. London began to watch the Tsar very carefully. Then, in May of 1853, Nicholas dispatched Prince Alexander Menshikov to Constantinople. On paper, Menshikov was a diplomat. In practice, he was a wrecking ball wearing a tailcoat. He arrived with a list of demands that went far beyond any previous Russian request. Not merely the protection of Orthodox holy sites in Jerusalem, which Russia had claimed before, but an unprecedented treaty granting Russia the right to act as protector of all 12 million Orthodox Christians living within Ottoman borders. All 12 million. The Ottoman Sultan, Abdul Mesid I, advised by British Ambassador Stratford Canning, who made very clear that Britain would support Ottoman resistance, rejected the demand. Menshikov departed Constantinople in fury. Diplomatic relations between Russia and the Porte were severed. And on June 21st, 1853, Russian armies crossed the Prut River and occupied Moldavia and Wallachia, Ottoman vassal states that today form the nation of Romania. Britain and France had interests in this, and their interests were not charitable. Britain's was straightforward and brutal in its clarity. The route to India ran through the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean was controlled by whoever held the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, which were Ottoman territory. If Russia broke through the dying empire and claimed the straits, then every British merchant vessel, every Royal Navy warship, every trade route connecting London to Bombay would pass through waters that the Tsar could close at will. The British had not built the most valuable empire in history to hand its jugular vein to Nicholas I over a religious dispute. France's interest was different and in some ways more honest about its lack of nobility. Napoleon III, nephew of the great Napoleon, president turned emperor through coup, a man who understood that his legitimacy rested on military prestige, needed a war he could win. He had already clashed with Russia over Catholic and Orthodox rights to the holy places in Jerusalem, a dispute that sounds absurd in retrospect, but was, in 1853, a genuine source of prestige politics between two empires measuring themselves against each other through the architecture of faith. Napoleon wanted vindication. He wanted glory. He wanted France back on the stage it had occupied under his uncle. The Ottoman crisis gave him his entry point. But here is what gave them both, Britain and France, the justification to act. The thing that turned diplomacy into mobilization. The thing that shocked the Western world into fury. It was Sinop. It was 30 minutes of fire on a foggy November morning. It was the Péjans' guns. And before we can understand what came after, we must understand what Russia built in Sevastopol, what the alliance assembled against it, and why this particular peninsula became the killing ground of empires. Sevastopol sits at the southwestern tip of the Crimean Peninsula, like a fist thrust into the Black Sea. The city had been the home of Russia's Black Sea fleet since Catherine the Great ordered it built in 1783. And in the 70 years since then, it had grown into something far more than a naval base. It was a fortress city, a monument to Russian maritime ambition, a place where the sea itself seemed to serve at the Tsar's pleasure. The harbour, a deep, sheltered inlet surrounded by high ground on three sides, was one of the finest natural anchorages in the world. The Russians had spent decades improving on nature's gift. By 1854, Sevastopol was protected by 974 guns mounted across a ring of bastions, forts and redoubts that engineers had spent generations refining. The Malakoff Redoubt, rising on a hill at the harbour's southeastern end, was the keystone of the entire defensive system, a position of such tactical dominance that every military engineer who looked at it understood the same thing. Take the Malakoff and Sevastopol falls. Leave the Malakoff standing and Sevastopol holds forever. To capture this place, the Allied powers assembled a force that was impressive in numbers and deeply flawed in almost everything else. 50,000 men, 28,000 French, 20,000 British, 6,000 Ottoman, boarded transport ships at the Bulgarian port of Varna in early September 1854 and sailed for the Crimean coast. The British contingent carried the army's most powerful secret weapon, the new pattern 1853 Enfield rifle. This was not a refinement of previous technology, but a revolution in it. A smoothbore musket of the Napoleonic era was accurate to perhaps 50 yards and took 30 seconds to reload. The Enfield, with its rifled barrel and mini-ball ammunition, was accurate to 300 yards and could be reloaded in 15 seconds. The men carrying it could kill an enemy soldier at 6 times the range of any weapon that enemy carried. The Russians had not yet equipped their infantry with equivalent weapons. This single technological gap would cost them thousands of lives before anyone fully understood why. But technology was not the army's problem. Logistics was. Command was. Vision was. Lord Fitzroy Somerset, now Lord Raglan, commander of the British forces, was 66 years old, had lost his right arm at Waterloo 40 years earlier, and had spent the intervening decades in administrative positions. He was a decent man, courteous and composed, but he had not commanded troops in the field in 4 decades, and it showed in ways both subtle and catastrophic. His supply system was a disgrace. When the army left England, no one had ordered winter clothing. No one had arranged adequate hospital ships. No one had calculated how much ammunition a besieging army would require for a campaign that might last weeks or months or, God forbid, longer. The officers assumed Sevastopol would fall quickly. The officers were wrong about almost everything. Colonel Eduard Tottleben was not an officer who made assumptions. The 35-year-old Russian military engineer arrived in Sevastopol in the late summer of 1854 with a particular gift that no artillery bombardment could destroy: the ability to see, faster than anyone else, what needed to be built and to build it before the enemy arrived. When the Allied fleet appeared off the Crimean coast, and Russian commanders finally understood that the attack was truly coming, Sevastopol's landward defences were minimal. A few old earthworks, several obsolete cannon, nothing that would delay a determined assault for more than an afternoon. Tottleben changed this in weeks. Working through nights that grew steadily colder, directing hundreds of soldiers and sailors and pressed civilians, he threw up a system of bastions and connecting trenches that transformed the city's southern approaches into an interlocking network of killing ground. The Great Redan, the Flagstaff Bastion, the Malakoff Redoubt, positions that would absorb hundreds of thousands of shells and thousands of human lives over the next 11 months. Most of them rose from Tottleben's drafting table in those desperate weeks of September 1854. He was not defending a city, he was building a labyrinth, and he was filling it with men willing to die in it. Those men deserve a moment before the killing begins. On the night of October 16th, 1854, the last quiet night before the Allied guns opened fire, a young British soldier sat in a tent on the heights south of Sevastopol and wrote a letter home to his mother in Shropshire. We do not know his name. His letter survived in a collection of Crimean correspondence, unsigned, smudged with the red Crimean earth that got into everything. He wrote that the peninsula was beautiful in an unexpected way. Bare hills rolling down to a sea so blue it hurt to look at directly. Air so clean and cold it made your lungs ache. He wrote that he missed her cooking. He wrote that he wasn't afraid, and then crossed it out and wrote it again, as though saying it twice might make it true. He sealed the letter and went to sleep. In the morning, the guns began. Inside Sevastopol, in the harbour district, a naval officer named Mikhail spent his last evening of peace in a way that Russian officers had spent evenings before battles for centuries. He attended Vespers in the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, stood through the long liturgy with his cap in his hands, and prayed the way men pray when they are genuinely frightened. Not for victory, not for glory, but simply to see the next day. Around him stood hundreds of others. The candles made the icons glow amber. The choir sang the ancient words, and outside, in the harbour, the shapes of the scuttled ships, deliberately sunk by Russian command to block the harbour entrance, the sacrifice of the fleet to save the city, lay just beneath the dark water, their masts still above the surface like grave markers. The Russians had traded their navy for time. Whether time would be enough was the question that hung over every prayer that night. Leo Tolstoy was 26 years old and already a published writer when he arrived in Sevastopol as an artillery officer in November 1854. He came partly from duty and partly from something harder to name, a compulsion to see, to witness, to stand in the truth of a thing rather than receive it second-hand. What he found in Sevastopol would shatter and remake him. He walked the hospital wards. He stood at the gun batteries during bombardments. He watched men die in the specific, unglamorous ways that men actually die in war. Not heroically, but messily, crying for their mothers, confused about where they were, their bodies betraying them in ways that no painting of battle ever captured. He wrote it all down. The Sevastopol sketches, published during and after the siege, were unlike anything Russian literature had produced. Unflinching, immediate, shot through with a moral horror that the author could not quite name, but could not stop describing. Tolstoy left Sevastopol convinced of something that would haunt every book he ever wrote afterward. That war was not what men said it was, and that the gap between what war looked like and what it actually was might be the most important truth a writer could spend a life pursuing. The Allied plan was simple, as plans often are before they meet reality. The French and British would land, march to Sevastopol, bombard the city's defences into rubble, and storm through the ruins. Estimates varied. Some officers thought it could be done in a week. None thought it would take 11 months. The first evidence that the plan was inadequate came on September 20th, 1854, at the Alma River, 12 miles north of Sevastopol, where Russian forces under Prince Menshikov held the high ground above the river crossing and waited for the Allied army to come to them. The Battle of the Alma began at noon on September 20th in the particular golden light of a Crimean autumn that made the hillside look almost peaceful from a distance. It was not peaceful. The Russian position, 33,000 men arranged along the ridgeline above the river, artillery dominating every approach, was formidable enough that Menshikov had invited civilians from Sevastopol to watch from the hills behind his line. He expected a Russian victory. He had brought spectators. This was his first mistake. The French moved first, pressing up the western flank where cliffs dropped to the sea and Russian attention was weakest. Scaling heights they'd been told were impassable, while the Russian command scrambled to respond to an attack from an angle they hadn't fully prepared for. The British advance in the centre was slower, more costly, more direct. The Light Division and the division under General de Lacy Evans waded the Alma River under fire, men falling in the shallows, the current running darker downstream, and began the climb toward the Russian guns. The Enfield rifles were doing what no Russian commander had planned for. British soldiers were shooting accurately at 300 yards, dropping Russian artillerymen before they could reload, killing the men who served the guns that were killing the men climbing the hill. The mathematics of the new technology were brutal and unfamiliar. The Russian battalions, trained to absorb musket fire at close range and hold their ground, found themselves dying at distances they'd never considered dangerous. But the British nearly threw it away. Lord Raglan rode forward, personally, dangerously, without adequate escort, and positioned himself ahead of his own infantry on a small knoll that happened to command a view of the entire Russian rear. He could see, from this exposed position, that Menshikoff's forces were beginning to waver. He ordered 2 artillery pieces forward to that knoll, opened fire on the Russian flank, and created the impression of a British force already in the Russian rear. The psychological shock broke something in the Russian formation. The great redoubt, the central position that the whole Russian line depended on, was carried by the Highland Brigade at the cost of terrible casualties. Men climbing through fire that turned the grass around them into a burning carpet, reaching the top, gasping and blood-streaked and refusing to stop. The Russians retreated. The Allies had won the first engagement of the campaign. And then Raglan did nothing. He had his cavalry, fresh and unblooded, standing ready to pursue a retreating army in disorder. A pursuit would have devastated Menshikoff's force, possibly ended the siege before it started, possibly ended the war in weeks. Raglan did not order it. His reasons were complicated: concern for his flanks, uncertainty about French cooperation, the deeply ingrained British officer class belief that exploitation of victory was somehow ungentlemanly. Menshikoff's army retreated in good order, reached Sevastopol and reinforced its garrison. The war would last 3 more years. That afternoon of inaction at the Alma cost more lives than all the carnage of the battle itself. The Allied forces turned south and marched towards Sevastopol, arriving on its outskirts to find that Tottleben had not been idle. The earthworks they encountered were not the minimal defences their reconnaissance had reported, but a growing system of bastions and trenches that seemed to expand overnight, as though the ground itself was conspiring against them. On October 17, 1854, the Allied artillery opened fire on the city in the first great bombardment of the siege. 126 guns on the land side, the combined fleet offshore pouring shot into the harbour defences. The noise was heard in Constantinople. The ground shook for miles, and when the smoke cleared, Tottleben's engineers were already filling shell craters, rebuilding collapsed parapets, repositioning guns that had been dismounted by the barrage. By morning, the defences were largely restored. The Allies fired again the next day, and the next. The pattern of the siege established itself with horrifying clarity. Destroy by day, rebuild by night. Fire again at dawn. Repeat until someone broke. Admiral Vladimir Kornilov, the brilliant, energetic officer who had organized Sevastopol's first desperate defense, died on October 17th, the very first day of bombardment. A shell fragment struck him on the head as he stood at the 4th bastion, watching his guns answer the Allied fire. He fell. His last words, repeated in every Russian account of the siege, were addressed to the officers kneeling beside him. "Do not abandon Sevastopol." He was 45 years old. Nakhimov, who had won at Sinop and could have rested on that glory, stepped into the defence and worked himself without mercy, spending his days on the exposed ramparts, visible to his men, refusing to duck when the shells came close. His sailors revered him absolutely. He would die the same way Kornilov had died 8 months later. A sniper's bullet finding him on the walls of the bastion he had held through everything. 8 days after Kornilov's death, the Russians decided to go on the offensive and break the siege from outside rather than endure it from within. On October 25, 1854, Russian cavalry and infantry moved against the Allied supply base at the small harbour town of Balaclava, 6 miles southeast of Sevastopol. The battle that followed would produce 2 of the most famous images in the history of the British Army. One of stubborn courage, and one of incomprehensible, magnificent folly. The thin red line came first. As Russian cavalry swept around the Allied flank toward Balaclava harbour itself, the only thing standing between them and the British supply base was the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders. 550 men in two thin lines where military doctrine demanded a defensive square. Sir Colin Campbell, their commander, had told them there was no retreat. So they stood. The Russian cavalry, nearly 3 times their number, came on at the trot, expecting the thin British formation to break or form square. It did neither. The Highlanders fired. At 250 yards, the Enfield spoke in volleys, and the men who had ridden confidently toward what should have been easy prey began to fall in numbers that made the charge seem suddenly, fatally miscalculated. The Russian horsemen pulled up. Then they turned. 550 men had stopped a cavalry charge that should have rolled over them like a wave. William Russell of the Times watched it from a hillside and wrote the phrase that would attach itself to that moment for all time. A thin red streak tipped with a line of steel. But the same battle, hours later, produced something very different. Lord Raglan, watching from the heights, issued an order to recover cannon the Russians were attempting to carry off from an overrun Ottoman position. The order, drafted by his Adjutant General Airy and carried to the cavalry commander Lord Lucan by the impetuous Captain Nolan, was ambiguous in precisely the way that military orders must never be ambiguous. Lucan, unable to see what Raglan could see from the heights, asked Nolan which guns were meant. Nolan gestured, some say carelessly, some say deliberately, accounts disagree, toward the far end of the valley, toward the main Russian battery, surrounded on 3 sides by enemy guns. 673 horsemen of the Light Brigade formed into lines and began their charge. They rode into a valley bounded on 3 sides by Russian artillery. The guns opened fire from the front, the left, and the right simultaneously. The Light Brigade rode into a tunnel of smoke and metal, and emerging statistics: 110 dead, 130 wounded, over 300 horses killed or maimed. They reached the Russian guns at the far end. They broke the battery. They turned around and rode back through the same storm they had ridden through going forward. 247 men did not return. Lord Cardigan, their commander, reached the Russian guns and then, seeing no supporting infantry, turned his horse and rode back alone, arriving at the British lines with a look on his face that no one present could afterward describe adequately. Alfred Lord Tennyson read Russell's dispatch in the Times and wrote, "The charge of the Light Brigade in a single sitting. Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die." He meant it as tribute. It was also, inadvertently, an indictment. And so the dying continued. Through October, through November, through the Battle of Inkerman on November 5th, where 20,000 Russian troops attacked the British right flank in early morning fog so thick that regiments couldn't see their neighbours, where the fighting degenerated into individual combat with rifles used as clubs, where the foot guards and the line regiments held by sheer bloody obstinacy against odds that should have destroyed them, where the Russians lost 12,000 men and still did not break the siege. The battle settled into its terrible rhythm: fire and repair, rebuild and fire again. And then the winter came, and the winter was the cruelest enemy of all. The temperature on the Crimean plateau dropped to -30 in January. The men in the siege trenches had no greatcoats. The ships carrying winter equipment had been destroyed in a November storm in Balaclava harbour, along with their cargo and 30 of the men who served on them. The British Army, which had not fought a continental campaign in 40 years, had not planned for winter with any seriousness. The soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: torn canvas, straw, pieces of dead horses' blankets, and continued to man their positions because the orders required it and because there was nowhere else to go. Cholera moved through the camps. Typhoid followed. Dysentery was so prevalent it was almost not worth mentioning. The French suffered terribly. The Ottomans died in the thousands. The British, stoic, furious, increasingly vocal about the incompetence that had left them to freeze, began to write letters home, letters that found their way to William Russell at the Times, and through Russell to the British public, which received them with an anger that shook Parliament to its foundations. Florence Nightingale arrived at the Barrack Hospital in Scutari, across the Bosphorus from Constantinople, in November 1854, with 38 nurses and a conviction that could move mountains, or at least persuade military bureaucracies to allow women to clean their hospitals. What she found was not a hospital. It was a warehouse of dying. 2,000 men lay on floors and in corridors with no proper beds, no adequate sanitation, no systematic wound care, no supply of basic medicines. The mortality rate was 42%. Men who had survived Russian guns and Crimean cold were dying of infections acquired after they arrived at the facility meant to save them. Nightingale began with what she had: clean water, carbolic soap, basic dressings, and an absolute refusal to accept the system's explanations for why things could not be improved. She organised the wards. She established sanitation protocols. She personally attended the dying through nights that lasted until dawn. 6 months later, the mortality rate at Scutari had fallen to 2%. She had not performed surgery. She had not discovered new medicines. She had simply insisted, with a ferocity that brooked no argument, that wounded men be kept clean and fed and attended to as human beings rather than administrative problems. The Crimean War produced many legacies, and not all of them were political, and not all of them were built from death. Florence Nightingale's was built from something that outlasted the war by centuries: the understanding that medical care was not charity but duty, that the organisation of healing was as important as the science of it, and that a woman with a lamp walking hospital corridors at 2 a.m. could save as many lives as a general commanding a division. Back in England, the public reaction to Russell's dispatches, and to the casualty lists, and to the dawning understanding that their soldiers were dying of cold and hunger and mismanagement as much as enemy action, produced a political earthquake. The government of Prime Minister Lord Aberdeen, a man of genuine decency and limited political survival instincts, fell on a vote of no confidence in January 1855, the first British government to fall during a war since the American Revolution. The Aberdeen ministry was replaced by the Palmerston government, which was more aggressive, more organised, and more politically attuned to the public's demand for both reform and victory. The army's supply system was restructured. The Grand Crimean Central Railway, an extraordinary feat of rapid engineering, was built to connect the port of Balaclava to the siege lines, eliminating the supply chaos that had contributed so much to the winter's suffering. Ammunition began to arrive in quantities that the siege required. The spring of 1855 arrived, and with it a changed war. Tsar Nicholas I did not live to see what his ambitions had created. He died in St. Petersburg on March 2, 1855, officially of pneumonia. Pneumonia contracted during a review of troops in cold weather, because even at the end, he could not stop performing the role he had been playing since birth. The court whispered other things, that he had died of shame, that a man who had governed for 30 years through the certainty of Russian superiority could not survive the discovery that it was false. His son, Alexander II, inherited a war, a humiliated army, and an empire that needed, as anyone could see, to be rebuilt from the ground up. Alexander looked at his father's legacy with clear eyes, and what he saw forced him, eventually, to conclusions his father would have considered treasonous. The months that followed Nicholas's death saw the Allied siege intensify with a methodical savagery that the defenders met with equal determination. Nakhimov walked the ramparts, Totalleben, wounded in May 1855 by a musket ball that tore through his leg, but refused to accept evacuation, directed the engineering work from a cot behind the lines, sketching countermine diagrams between doses of morphine. The French had finally identified what their British colleagues had understood in theory and failed to exploit in practice. The Malakoff redoubt was the key to everything. Whoever held the Malakoff held Sevastopol. On June 17th, a major Allied assault on the Malakoff was repulsed with heavy losses. French soldiers reached the outer works and were thrown back in hand-to-hand fighting that lasted for hours and accomplished nothing except to fill the casualty rolls on both sides with more names. But the intelligence gathered in that failed assault was invaluable. The French command spent the summer planning the next attempt with a precision that bordered on obsession. The sixth and final bombardment of Sevastopol began on September 5, 1855. On that morning, 807 Allied guns opened fire simultaneously, a noise that men present described as something beyond sound. Something felt in the chest and spine, a physical pressure that knocked men off their feet before they heard anything. 307 cannon fired 150,000 rounds in a single day. The city burned, the bastions burned, the harbour burned. Russian casualties inside the defences ran to 3,000 men a day, and still the garrison manned its positions. Because the order was to hold, and because the men in those positions had endured 11 months of this, and were past the point where additional horror changed their behaviour. They had become something beyond afraid. They had become simply present, alive or dead, here, in this place, doing this thing. On September 8th, at noon precisely, the French assault columns moved against the Malakoff redoubt. This time, there was no preliminary hesitation, no adjustment to the timing of the attack. General McMahon had studied the defenders' patterns with the patience of a chess player. He knew that the garrison rotated at noon, that for approximately 15 minutes in the middle of each day, the Malakoff was defended by men who had just arrived rather than men who had been there for hours. The French came at noon. They were over the parapet before the relief had found their positions. McMahon planted his flag in the earthworks, and when a general behind him sent a message asking if he could hold, McMahon sent back 4 words that passed immediately into military legend. J'y suis, j'y reste. I am here, I stay here. The British assault on the Great Redan, launched simultaneously, was a different story. The rocky ground prevented approach trenches from being dug close enough to the walls, which meant the attacking columns had to cross 200 yards of open ground under concentrated fire before they reached the objective. The Light Division went first, losing men at every step, reaching the parapet and pouring over it into a nightmare of close combat, where Russian defenders fought with rifle butts and bayonets in spaces too small for tactics or formation. The British couldn't hold what they'd taken. They were thrown back. A second assault failed. A third was forming when orders came to stand down. The Malakoff had fallen, and without the Malakoff, the Great Redan was a position no longer worth the men it would cost to hold it. Inside Sevastopol, the Russian command understood what the loss of the Malakoff meant within minutes of its fall. Prince Gorchakov, who had replaced Menshikov in command months earlier, gave the order with the calm of a man who had been thinking about this moment for weeks. The powder magazines were to be blown. The remaining ships in the harbour were to be scuttled. The garrison was to cross the bridge of boats to the northern side of the harbour and take up new positions there. The demolitions began at midnight. The great magazines exploded one after another through the dark hours, each explosion lighting the sky like temporary dawn, each shockwave felt by men on both sides of the lines, each one marking the deliberate self-destruction of something that had taken decades and thousands of lives to build. The last ships of the Black Sea Fleet settled to the bottom of the harbour their crews had served in. And by morning, when the Allied troops entered the southern city, they walked through ruins that bore no resemblance to the thriving military port that had existed 11 months before. The streets were empty, the buildings were shells, the guns were silenced. Sevastopol had not surrendered. It had consumed itself rather than give anything intact to its enemies. The morning of September 9th, 1855, was quiet over Sevastopol in the way that mornings are quiet only after everything that could make noise has been destroyed. British and French soldiers entered the southern city with the careful footsteps of men who had been told the Russians were gone, but could not quite believe it. They found streets carpeted in debris, shattered stone, broken gun carriages, torn canvas, the personal effects of thousands of men who had evacuated carrying nothing but themselves. They found the churches still standing, their interiors largely intact, icons watching from their frames with expressions that had witnessed centuries of human foolishness and had achieved something close to equanimity. They found the hospitals still holding the severely wounded who could not be moved, Russian soldiers and sailors lying in rows, tended now by whatever enemies had enough humanity left to tend them after 11 months of trying to kill each other. The smell of the city was smoke and blood, and the particular sweetness of recent explosive, a smell that men who have been in sieges carry in their memory for the rest of their lives. Pavel Nakhimov was not there to see it. He had died on June 30th, 1855, on the ramparts of the second bastion, a sniper's bullet striking him in the head as he stood with his telescope to his eye, looking, as he had spent 11 months looking, toward the Allied lines. He had been warned repeatedly that he was too visible, that Russian officers should not present themselves as targets on the open parapets, that the British rifle's range made his habit of standing upright and in full uniform during bombardments suicidal. He listened to these warnings with the patient attention of a man who has already decided that survival is not the primary concern. He was 51 years old. His sailors carried him on their shoulders through the streets of the city he had defended, and the procession that followed his coffin was the longest Sevastopol had seen. The man who had destroyed the Ottoman fleet at Sinop and had spent the year since defending what that victory had made inevitable was buried in the city that refused to outlast him. The tally of the war, assembled afterward with the imprecision that all such tallies contain, was staggering. Total dead across all parties, approximately 650,000 human beings. The vast majority of them killed, not by weapons, but by cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and exposure. Russia lost an estimated 400,000 soldiers and civilians and the men who served in the siege. Britain, which had entered the war with the smallest ground force, lost 21,000, more than three-quarters of them to disease. France lost 95,000. The Ottomans, fighting in their own defence, lost 45,000 and perhaps many more. The Ottoman records were incomplete, and the civilian toll was never adequately counted. Sardinia-Piedmont, whose 12,000 men had joined the coalition in January 1855 in exchange for a seat at the eventual peace conference, lost 2,000, fewer proportionally than anyone else, and gained diplomatically more than anyone else, a transaction that a young Piedmontese politician named Camillo di Cavour had engineered with a precision that would serve him well when, 6 years later, he helped build the unified Italian state that Sardinia's Crimean sacrifice had partly purchased. Nicholas I's death in March 1855 had passed command of Russia's fate to his son Alexander, and Alexander II arrived at the peace table in Paris with a clarity about his country's situation that his father had never permitted himself. The negotiations that produced the Treaty of Paris, signed on March 30th, 1856, were conducted in the French capital with a diplomatic efficiency that concealed how completely the balance of power in Europe had shifted. The key provisions were simple and devastating. Russia was forbidden from maintaining warships on the Black Sea, 5 decades of naval investment erased by a clause. The Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, nominally still under Ottoman suzerainty, were to be governed autonomously, a provision that everyone in the room understood as a step toward the independent Romania that would emerge within a generation. The Danube was opened to the shipping of all nations. The Ottoman Empire's territorial integrity was collectively guaranteed by the great powers, which sounded like protection, but was, in practice, the moment the empire's fate was taken out of its own hands and placed in those of its creditors. Russia surrendered the southern portion of Bessarabia at the mouth of the Danube, and Kars, the Caucasian city Russia had captured in a successful eastern campaign, was returned to the Ottoman Empire in exchange for Sevastopol. The signing ceremony was brief and formal. The Russian delegate signed with a hand that trembled slightly. Observers noted it and were unsure whether it was age, cold, or emotion. The Ottoman delegate sat very straight, as men sit when they are trying not to show that they understand exactly what has just happened to them. Britain and France accepted the treaty with relief that was only partly masked by satisfaction. Napoleon III had his victory, his military prestige, his vindication. He had also, without quite understanding it, planted the seeds of a European realignment that would, within 2 decades, undo everything the war had appeared to establish. But that reckoning was for the future, and in March 1856, the future seemed manageable. What the Crimean War actually accomplished, once the smoke and the diplomatic language had cleared, was something far larger and more durable than the specific territorial provisions of the Treaty of Paris. It ended a world and announced another one. The world it ended was the world of the Concert of Europe, the system of great power cooperation established at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which should maintain something resembling peace among the major powers for nearly 40 years by treating European stability as a collective responsibility. The Crimean War did not merely disrupt this system, it destroyed the assumptions on which it rested. Austria, which had remained neutral while Russia, the power that had saved Austria from Hungarian Revolution only 6 years earlier, was being defeated, emerged from the conflict diplomatically isolated and fatally weakened. The ingratitude was breathtaking, and it was noted in St. Petersburg with a bitterness that would shape Russian foreign policy for decades. The alliance between Russia and Austria, that had been the cornerstone of conservative European order since 1815, was effectively over, and in the power vacuum its dissolution created two men, Otto von Bismarck in Prussia and Camillo di Cavour in Piedmont, would move with extraordinary speed to accomplish the unification of Germany and Italy respectively, reshaping the European map in ways that the framers of the Treaty of Paris had not anticipated and could not have prevented. For Russia, the consequences were simultaneously humiliating and clarifying. Alexander II looked at his inheritance, a vast empire that had been unable to defend a single peninsula against a coalition of second-tier powers, and understood that the problem was not military in the narrow sense, but civilizational in the profound one. Russia's army had been brave. Its soldiers had held Sevastopol for 11 months against forces that outnumbered and outgunned them. Its commanders, Todleben above all, had been brilliant. But bravery and brilliance could not substitute for a railroad network adequate to move armies, or a telegraph system adequate to coordinate them, or an industrial base adequate to equip them with modern weapons, or an economic system flexible enough to fund it all. And none of these things could be built while 23 million serfs, a third of the empire's population, were legally bound to the land and to the lords who owned it, unable to move to cities, unable to work in factories, unable to participate in the market economy that was generating the industrial power that Britain and France were now deploying as weapons. 6 years after the Treaty of Paris, on March 3, 1861, Alexander II issued the Emancipation Reform, freeing the serfs. The Crimean War's most profound consequence was not on any map or in any treaty clause. It was in that document, which unlocked a transformation of Russian society that would continue for the next 60 years, through the revolution that destroyed the Romanovs and everything that came after. The war transformed warfare itself in ways that strategists and engineers spent the following decades absorbing. The telegraph, connecting frontline commanders to their capitals in near real time, changed the nature of military decision-making. Governments could now interfere with battlefield choices as never before. And the Crimean War's record was full of examples of what happened when they did and when they didn't. The railway, demonstrated in the construction and operation of the Grand Crimean Central Railway, showed that modern armies could not function without industrial logistics, that the supply chain was as important as the fighting force. The Enfield rifle and its continental equivalents established that the age of massed formation infantry tactics, the tactics of Waterloo and before, was over. That soldiers could now kill accurately at ranges that made the close-packed battlefield formations of the Napoleonic era suicidal. The ironclad warship, which the French deployed experimentally at the bombardment of Kinburn in October 1855, announced the end of the wooden navy that had ruled the seas since Drake, and announced the beginning of the naval arms race that would define the next century. And the Pigeon gun, demonstrated so devastatingly at Sinop, forced every naval power in the world to accept that the age of wooden ships of the line was over, before the last of them had even been built. Florence Nightingale returned to England after the war and spent the next 50 years being systematically unsatisfied with the state of British military medicine, public health and hospital administration. She did not rest on Scutari. She wrote, organised, lobbied, testified, corresponded with prime ministers and generals and sanitation engineers and statisticians. She invented, with the mathematician William Farr, new techniques of statistical visualization, the famous polar area diagram, what we would today call an infographic, to communicate epidemiological data to audiences who would not read tables but could understand a picture. She argued that the vast majority of deaths in the Crimean War had been preventable, that the same principles that had saved lives at Scutari could save lives in every military hospital and civilian hospital in Britain, and that the failure to apply them was not ignorance but choice, and that choice had a moral dimension that the comfortable would prefer not to examine. She was right about all of it. The Crimean War made Florence Nightingale famous. Florence Nightingale made the Crimean War matter in a way that outlasted every treaty and territorial adjustment and political consequence it produced. The harbour at Sinop is quiet now. The fishing boats come and go on the same water where Nahimov's squadron anchored one November night and waited for the fog to lift. Tourists walk the old Ottoman fortifications, look out over the Black Sea, take photographs of the view. The harbour is blue and cold in winter, blue and warm in summer, and entirely indifferent to what happened here on the morning of November 30th, 1853. The wrecks of the Ottoman frigates have long since dissolved into silt and silence, and the names of the men who served aboard them, the watch that went below decks moments before the Russian guns opened fire, the sailors who tried to fight fires on burning ships with buckets while the world disintegrated around them, are not recorded anywhere that anyone now reads. In Sevastopol, a city that has been fought over and destroyed and rebuilt multiple times since 1855, because history sometimes returns to its favourite killing grounds, the Brotherhood Cemetery holds the remains of thousands of men from both sides of the siege. The graves are marked simply, many of them, with names and units and dates, the same dates appearing over and over through the winter months, when the real killing was done, not by battle, but by cold and disease, and the bureaucratic indifference of commanders who did not arrange for winter clothing. Tolstoy's Sevastopol sketches sit in libraries around the world, still read, still as honest as the day he wrote them, in the firelight of the besieged city. "The hero of my tale," he wrote in the conclusion of the last sketch, "whom I love with all the power of my soul, whom I have tried to portray in all his beauty, who has been, is, and will be beautiful, is truth." He was 26 years old when he wrote that sentence, standing in the ruins of Sevastopol. He spent the next 50 years of his life trying to live up to it. The war that had given him the sentence, the war that had burned a fleet in Sinop harbour, frozen armies on a Crimean plateau, shattered a Tsar's certainties, launched the modern nursing profession, ended the age of the wooden warship, and set in motion the unification of Italy and Germany and the emancipation of 23 million serfs. That war was also, in the end, about truth. The truth that power without modernity is only performance, that courage without logistics is only sacrifice, that an empire that cannot move its armies or feed them or keep them warm is not an empire at all, but only a very large map with a very short future. Centuries later, the Bienden still carries ships between the ports that empires built and fought and died for. The fog still comes in off the water on November mornings, thick and cold and indifferent. And somewhere beneath the surface of Sinop harbour, in the silt and darkness where light never reaches, the last fragments of Admiral Osman Pasha's fleet lie scattered on the bottom. A testament to 30 minutes of fire that changed the world. and to all the worlds that fire made impossible, and to the endless, terrible human capacity to mistake a beginning for an end.